Edifice of Trust podcast is a thoughtful discussion of today's current events from the perspective of America's founding principles. Welcome. From heart-pumping music to head-thumping commentary. We just lost Walter Williams recently. Dr. Williams was an economics professor at George Mason University. He died December 2nd, 2020. He was 84. Professor Williams was a strong proponent of free market economics. He was famous for saying he was glad that he went to college before white people began to like black people, because when he got a C, he knew he deserved a C, and when he got an A, he knew he had earned an A. But it was not his recent death that prompted me to write about him and some other old black men. Earlier this week, I watched a video by Robert L. Woodson, Race in America, Economics, that had been produced by Hillsdale College. Mr. Woodson earned a master's degree in social work from the University of Pennsylvania and worked his way up in the civil rights movement, becoming a director of the National Urban League and later at the American Enterprise Institute. He left AEI to found the Center for Neighborhood Enterprise, now the Woodson Center, to promote self-help solutions in low-income communities. He also writes frequent op-ed articles for the Wall Street Journal, which is where I first ran across Mr. Woodson. But I had run across Mr. Woodson recently in a new and unexpected way. I was reading an editorial in the Wall Street Journal. I admit the Wall Street Journal is one of my main sources of news, about how the Biden administration was stopping an effort started by the Trump administration to counter the toxic message of the 1619 Project, which asserts that America is an irredeemably racist country. That effort was called the 1776 Commission. That research eventually led me to a group called 1776 Unites. 1776 Unites is a, quote, nonpartisan and intellectually diverse alliance of writers, thinkers, and activists focused on solutions to our country's greatest challenges in education, culture, and upward mobility. 1776 Unites is a project of the Woodson Foundation. Any of you that are familiar with my commentaries will know that I often write about or quote Thomas Sowell, the Rose and Melton Friedman Senior Fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution. He is a prolific writer and author at age 90, who is famous for pointing out that blacks did better during segregation and under the onus of Jim Crow laws than they have done since the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the War on Poverty legislation introduced by President Lyndon B. Johnson. These three scholars, ages 84, 83, and 90, have profoundly different views on the problems afflicting black people than do those of many modern economists. A Fortune magazine article, 19 Black Economists to Know and Celebrate This Juneteenth and Beyond, featured black economists who point to systemic racism, labor market discrimination, residential segregation, the legacy of Jim Crow laws, and the enduring stigma of slavery as the reason that black people have been unable to thrive and get ahead in America. And then it dawned on me, those old black men had seen the before and the after of the civil rights movement and the war on poverty. Walter Williams had been born in 1936 in Philadelphia and grew up in Richard Allen housing projects. Robert L. Woodson was also born in Philadelphia, but a year later in 1937. Thomas Sowell was born in Gastonia, North Carolina in 1930 and rarely even saw a white person until he moved to Harlem at age 9. These old black men grew up poor and went to segregated schools and had to endure Jim Crow laws. They knew what black communities did in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. They lived it. They didn't have to conjure up a concept like systemic racism as the cause of black underperformance. Black apologists and Black Lives Matter assert that disparate outcomes are proof of racism in the system, but they are blind to the true causes of those outcomes. Despite recent events, white supremacists like the Proud Boys represent a very small fraction of the population, and they are definitely not part of the system. These old black men faced in-your-face racism and discrimination. Walter Williams fought a one-man battle against Jim Crow while serving in the Army, and even wrote a letter to President John F. Kennedy asking why Negroes should defend and defy and die for, quote, empty promises of freedom and equality. He even received a response to this letter from the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. Bob Woodson dropped out of high school to join the Air Force and turn his life around, going on to get a master's degree in social work and working with civil rights organizations like the NAACP and the Urban League. Thomas Sowell also had to drop out of high school and was eventually drafted into the Marines. Both Williams and Sowell earned their GEDs and worked menial jobs as they and Woodson went to college in order to prepare for life in America. In their youth, these young men faced real systemic racism and discrimination, but they were able to overcome these barriers and lead successful lives. It is easy to say that these men were exceptional, the scholarly equivalents to LeBron James. Not every person has the talent to become King James or a college professor, but each of these men have written and lectured about the fact that blacks in general were making progress even under the duress of Jim Crow and segregation. Progress that stopped after the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1965. Ponder that while you listen to a brief message. So, you are stuck at home in self-quarantine. What to do? You could watch television, but all the news talks about is the coronavirus, and there are no sports on TV. You could binge watch a Netflix movie, or you could read a book. Luckily for you, I have just published my new book, In Defense of Principle. It follows the same path of my earlier books, Principled Policy and Edifice of Trust. The book reviews what is happening around the globe and reaches the conclusion that the world is a mess. The book evaluates the existential threats and defense challenges that confront the United States from the perspective of the American founding principles, and develops policy recommendations based on those principles. You can find links to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Apple Books on my website, www.edificeoftrust.com. Thank you. Welcome back. The passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1965 should have launched black progress skyward and allowed them to become fully integrated into America. But as Williams, Woodson, and Sowell have pointed out on numerous occasions, that did not happen. The Civil Rights Act was accompanied by several other pieces of legislation known collectively as the War on Poverty that were pushed by the Johnson administration to help poor people, especially blacks. But while black poverty rates had declined rapidly prior to the War on Poverty, this rate of decline slowed substantially afterward. Concomitant with the intransience of poverty in the black community was a change in the black family life. Thomas Sowell has shown that in 1960, only 22% of black children lived in single-parent families, but that 30 years later, 66% of black children were in single-parent families. And the poverty rate of single-parent families, no matter your race, is much higher than that of two-parent families. Walter Williams points out that 71% of high school dropouts come from fatherless homes, as do 61% of suicides. 71% of pregnant teenagers come from fatherless homes. The point that these black men are trying to make, and me as well, is that when black men and women took charge of their lives, they did better. When segregation kept them out of school, they created their own schools. Woodson and Sowell started their academic careers at historically black colleges. When they were black from white fraternal orders, they created their own. They created their own civic organizations and charitable foundations. Blacks were building their own human capital, taking charge of their own lives. But after the Civil Rights Act and the War on Poverty, blacks stopped building their human capital and instead started building their political capital. Charles Blow wrote in the New York Times, February 1, 2021, quote, "It is easy to believe that black power and influence are growing in America, and that the logical conclusion is that a set of policies favoring the black community in America, a so-called black agenda, is growing more likely as the years pass and the percentage of non-white Americans rises," unquote. Jason Riley shows that black political power is false black power in his book of the same name. Blacks have given agency to third parties. As he says, quote, "If blacks want to begin replenishing their human capital, true power, they shouldn't look to politicians. They should look to their own past." If the antebellum slaveholders could see the state of the black community in the 21st century, they would be laughing in their graves. After a bloody civil war to emancipate the Negro slaves and 100 years of segregation and Jim Crow, black people finally achieved full status as citizens, only to give that agency that they had earned, the human capital that they had been building for decades, away to politicians and other enablers, and to proclaim that their fate was at the mercy of white people. These three old black men, Williams, Woodson, and Sowell, would say no. The fate of black people should be in their own hands. That is how freedom works. Thank you.